So we're now ready to get cutting and cut our fabric out. I've got all my pattern pieces at the ready. Now, this is obviously cut on fold for both the back and the front. So rather than fold the entire piece of fabric in half, which would only give me a small bit of fold to work with, what we'll do is we'll just fold it a little bit, cut one out, fold it a little bit more, cut the other one out. Now with a pattern piece, you're always going to have your grain line, and in this case this is the straight grain here, it's the centre front and it's where you cut on the fold, and you want that line to be parallel to the selvage. With knitted fabrics, you can, if you look closely, you can even sort of see the direction of the knit. So if you're doing a printed fabric and you're not sure which way round to cut, just make sure that you cut so that those little V's are going in vertical lines down your body. Now with the Breton stripe, it's actually extremely easy to work out which way to cut it, because of course we know that we want those stripes to go horizontally around our body. So I'm obviously going to cut it this way. So the first thing that I want to do is just to take my fabric, lay it out nice and flat, and just fold it in far enough that that piece is going to fit. So I'll just roughly fold it to begin with. And you know, jersey is a bit frustrating because it does have a tendency to sort of curl up a bit, but you just have to take your time and make sure that everything's lying nice and flat. It kind of wants to spring around a little bit. So like I said, I'm just going to cut out one piece at a time. Let's see. That's a deep enough fold to fit my pattern piece without going into the selvage there, so I'm quite happy with that. Now, what I like to do is, what I really want to make sure of is that these stripes are sitting on top of each other when it's folded. I don't want to accidentally sort of fold it like that and then end up with my stripe not being perfectly horizontal across my body, across the top itself. So what I like to do is just choose a stripe. So let's choose this one here, and I'm just going to fold the fabric back there, and then I'm just going to walk my finger across that stripe, making sure that it's lined up and it's not, you know, I'm not accidentally, it's quite a narrow stripe, this one, and I don't want to kind of accidentally fold my fabric slightly diagonally and end up with a stripe which is not perfectly horizontal. Once I've got that, I'll just put a pin in there. And then just to make sure that that lovely horizontal stripe continues, what I'll do is I'll go every sort of 3 stripe, let's say, and just pop a pin in. And then I just want to make sure there's no wrinkles, folds or pleats on the underside of the fabric. And just have to take my time sort of smoothing everything out. So then again I'll go 1, 2, 3, and then let's put another pin in there. Just making sure that all those stripes are lovely, horizontal, lined up. They're sitting where I folded the fabric. Those stripes really want to be nicely sitting on top of each other and not kind of ruckling up and crossing over. So it just takes a little bit of time to kind of prep your fabric. So I can now see that all that's sitting nice and flat, the fabric underneath is nice and flat, these stripes are all lining up where it's folded. If I peel that back, I can see that those stripes are just continuing sort of straight along there. So I'm happy now to lay on my first pattern piece and get cutting. So these stripes where you folded should be at a perfect right angle with the fold. So it just takes a little bit of time. I've got cat fur stuck there, that's what I'm trying to remove, a little bit of cat fur. I think someone's been sat on here sometime in the night. No names mentioned, Kira. Anyway, there's my pattern piece. And what I want to do is I've got a lovely straight hem here, and I want to put this straight hem so that the bottom of the hem lines up with the bottom of one of the black stripes. And by doing that, I can do the same with the back and the front, so that when I come to sew my side seams together, I will be able to match the stripes along the side seams. So I've just got to remember that I'm cutting right along the bottom of one of those black stripes there, because that's a dead straight hem, and you can see that lovely right angle here. So that is just pressing up against the fold. So when I cut round here and I'm going to open up this pattern piece, I'll have my front of my top. And if you're using a plain jersey or a jersey that isn't stripy, you just have to make sure that you fold it and that this line is parallel to the selvage, or that it's, you know, along that straight line of knit. So I'm going to use, these are actually just coasters. I'm going to use these as my pattern weights. I'm going to use my rotary cutter to cut my top out, but you could use pins and scissors, or however you prefer to cut out. You can do your own method. I'm just going to use pattern weights. I've got my cutting mat underneath there, and here we go. So just very nice and slowly, and when I'm using my rotary cutter, this hand is always behind, never in front, because it's quite easy to slip and then you could hurt yourself. So just cutting that across there. It's a nice straight line, and just take it slowly. Now coming round that curve of the neckline and up to the top there. I'll just continue all the way to remove that piece of fabric. Across that shoulder angle, keeping nice and close to the edge. I want a really accurate cut, and this pattern includes seam allowance, so I'm just cutting, obviously following the edge of the pattern as my guide. Now this is quite tricky to get to, so if I find that I can't quite get to that angle, I might come around to the end of the table in a minute actually. So I'll do this one first, which is nice and easy to get to. Just following that line at the edge of the pattern piece. And then round the curve of that armhole there. Perfect. So that's my first piece cut. I can see that I've got a notch here, so I'm going to want to mark that, and I'm just going to, you can either snip into it, but I think I'm going to just mark it with a chalk. Just move those weights out of the way, and I'm just going to mark it on the inside of the jersey, not the outside. I've got a nice pink chalk mark on there, on the inside of my top. And you could snip into it, but I find that snipping on the jersey makes it curl up at that area. So there we have the front of our Breton striped t-shirt. So I'm now going to move on to do the back. So the first thing I'll do is to take out those pins from where I folded my jersey, and I'll just chop off that funny little spare bit of jersey that I've been left with at the end, and I'll keep that because I can test my stitches on that when I'm setting up my overlocker. Okay, so the next thing to do is just to fold again, repeat that same process, making sure that I choose a stripe, walk it across, and that I've got a nice clean fold, and then repeat the same process with the back panel. So I've cut out my front, I now need to cut out my back, and if you remember, it's the same bottom half, but the top half of the top is slightly different in shape, the armhole and the neckline. So I shall place this very carefully on that line, and I shall just put the masking tape on there, and then I'll cut round this. So I'm just going to leave that front bit, which is smaller, behind, and I'll put the back on top there. My stripes are sat horizontally and matched up and just pinned to hold them nice and true. And I've got my centre back line, my fold of my fabric just there, which is at right angles to that horizontal stripe. I need to remember that the bottom of my top, the hem of my top, was sitting at the bottom of one of those black lines, one of those black stripes. So I want to do exactly the same, so that those side seams where I want those stripes to match will match up. Put my pattern weights on, make sure everything's nice and flat underneath, make sure there are no wrinkles or in your fabric underneath. I'll just put my pattern weights on. And the other thing actually that's really important when you're cutting out with any fabric, but particularly with stretch or with knit fabrics and jerseys, is make sure that the remainder of your fabric is supported. If you're using a smaller table and your fabric was hanging off the end of your table, it would pull and drag, and then you'd end up with sort of this funny shape. So you want to make sure always that the entire weight of your fabric is supported, even if that means sort of cutting out on the floor if you can. Best to do that than to have kind of your fabric pulling on itself, hanging off the edge of your table. So once again, dead straight across that hem, and then I'll just continue as I did before, cutting out my top. And there's my back panel cut out. And now, onto the sleeves.
A quick extra note on cutting out your sleeves. On your armhole here, on your front bodice, you have a notch, and you have the corresponding notch here on the front of your sleeve. So these pieces will match up like so. If you want to match your stripes across the front of your bodice and across to your sleeve, then make a note of whereabouts on the stripe this notch is hitting, and correspond that back to whereabouts on the stripe this notch is hitting when you're cutting out. You won't be able to match the stripes all the way round the armhole, but this nice point here, which is right at your centre front, or right at the front I should say of your body, if those two stripes match up, you will get a stripe coming across your bodice and across your sleeve that matches up. The nature of the stripes depends on their width and spacing, but you might then also be able to not match a couple of stripes above and a couple of stripes below before the curved shape starts to kick them out as they travel across your sleeve head and under your arm. So just an extra note to just look at where these two notches sit and match them to the same position on your stripe when you're cutting out.
So there's my remaining bit of fabric there. If you're making a bigger size, the remaining bit you have over here might not be big enough to fit your sleeve. So then you would go down to the bottom half of your fabric and you've got fabric plenty enough there to cut your sleeve out. I'm going to make use of this bit up here. And I'm going to cut my sleeves out individually. Although I need to cut a pair, I am, rather than cutting on the fold, I'm just going to cut them out individually, and just because I just think that it's easier actually, because then you don't have to do the whole kind of, when you're folding it in half, the whole stripe matching thing. Let's pop that there, line my sleeve up with the bottom of that black stripe, and pattern weights on. You can see that this grain line is at exact right angles to the hem of the sleeve, so you know that if this hem here is running in line with the end of a stripe, you know that this is going to be correct for the grain, because that's right angles there. So that's done, and then I've marked on the notches around the sleeve head. Now if you have done my alteration adding in a gathered sleeve head, then you'll have a notch for the beginning of the gathers, a notch for the end of the gathers, a notch for the top of the sleeve head, and a notch to mark the front of the sleeve. if you've not done this alteration, then you will just have a notch to mark the front of the sleeve and a notch at the sleeve head. And I've just marked those on the wrong side of the fabric with my pink chalk. So that's sleeve number 1. I now need to do sleeve number 2. The important thing to know about sleeves is this is not exactly symmetrical. If I fold that in half down the grain line, you'll see that there is a difference in the pitch here of this curve. So we are cutting a pair, meaning that I don't want to cut another one like this. When I cut my next sleeve, I need to flip my pattern round and cut it like this. Otherwise I'll end up with 2 left sleeves. So make sure, because you're not cutting up, folding and then cutting 2 at a time, you're cutting them individually. Don't forget one like this and then one like this, so that you'll end up with a pair. Second sleeve done, and on to the neckband. Before I do that, just to give you another piece of advice, with jersey it's normally pretty obvious which is the right side and which is the wrong side. On the right side you'll see the traditional kind of typical V's that you get with knit fabrics, and on the wrong side you'll see that wiggly line if you look up closely, which is what we call the purl side. That's the knit side and the purl side. So it's pretty obvious that this is the right side of my jersey and this is the wrong side of my jersey. You'll also notice that the stripe itself is not got a very sharp edge on the wrong side, but on the right side it's got a nice sharp edge. If you're working with a fabric where it's really difficult to see which is the right or wrong side, just put a little X somewhere in the corner on the wrong side of all your pattern pieces so that you don't get confused later. So I've got a little bit of fabric just at the end here after I cut the sleeves, which is just about the right length for my neckband panel to fit onto. I've got a wider bit there, but I can save that for something else, but you might need to cut it from that other side. You just need to find yourself a long enough piece. This might be worth saying, just to kind of, obviously I'm making a size 38, making a larger size, you might want to just lay your pieces out first and decide how you're going to cut them out before starting to cut, just to make sure that you can fit everything in. So I've got my strip here for my neckband. This is going to be folded in half and sort of stretched around the neck. I actually like to cut this way so that the horizontal stripes are going here. If I cut it this way, when I fold it in half, it's not going to look that attractive going around the neck, but this way it will make a nice effect. And if I show you that Tilly in the Buttons pattern, you can see how she's got a lovely striped t-shirt there, and then she's got her neckband there with the horizontal stripes, which I think looks really nice. So well done, we've cut out our t-shirt, and for 5 pattern pieces that was quite a lot of effort, so well done if you've gotten this far. We're now ready to do the fun bit, which is sewing. So I've got my front, my back, my neckline band and my pair of sleeves. Once you're happy that you've got everything cut, then we can set up our sewing machines and our overlockers if we're using them, and finally we can get on with sewing.